All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am the dramatic historian, and today we are joined by one of the foremost historians of the American Civil War, Timothy B. Smith. Dr. Smith is widely recognized for his exhaustive and deeply researched work on the Vicksburg campaign, a campaign that fundamentally reshaped the course of the war and secured Union control of the Mississippi River. For those of you unfamiliar with Dr. Smith's work, he's produced several key works covering the American Civil War. He's written extensively on Shiloh, Corinth, Albert Sidney Johnson, Champions Hill, Grierson's Raid. And that's enough for most historians of the age, but not for Dr. Smith. He's produced the definitive series on the Vicksburg campaign. It's a 5-part series that traces Grant's failed overland route to Vicksburg through its siege and surrender in July of 1863. And over the course of this multi-volume series published by the University of Kansas Press, Dr. Smith has actually taken readers step by step through strategy, operations, and the human experience. From the early maneuvers and failed approaches through the bold and inland campaign, and ultimately to the siege and surrender, his work stands out as not just its narrative, but its careful use of primary sources, terrain analysis, and willingness to revisit long-held assumptions about command decisions and battlefield performance. In addition to his scholarship on Vicksburg, Dr. Smith has written exclusively on preservation, memory, and helping his audience understand not just what happened, but why it still matters even today. We're very excited to talk with him about his series and its complexity and its controversies and why it remains one of the most remarkable operational achievements of the war. Dr. Smith, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, just to start off, what was it that actually originally drew you to undertake this multi-volume history of the Vicksburg campaign? And did you always envision it as a 5-book project?
No, I there are a couple of different things that got me interested in Vicksburg. Number one, I grew up down in Mississippi, probably a couple of hours from Vicksburg, and we would go there very often. I had ancestors there. I had about 4 or 5 ancestors in the Vicksburg campaign. 3 of them surrendered at Vicksburg. So the family history, the local history, all of that always appealed to me. What really turned me to do these volumes was when I got done with the trilogy on the Tennessee River campaign, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and then Corinth. I thought, the logical thing to do would be just to follow the Army of the Tennessee right on down the river, and so I started working on those. Didn't intend it to be a 5-volume series at the beginning, and it's kind of funny how that worked out. I did volume 4 and 5 first, and then I went back and did 1, 2, and 3, which is kind of a Star Wars type of treatment, if you will, a little prequel kind of stuff. But the first volume I did was really what is volume 4, the assaults. And at that time, many of your listeners will know historian Mike Ballard, a close friend of mine. He's passed away now, unfortunately, but very well known in Vicksburg circles, Vicksburg, Pemberton biography, all of that. He had always said he was going to work on a book on the siege, and so I thought, if he's doing the siege, one of the most underrated battles of the Civil War probably are the assaults on Vicksburg. And so I asked Mike, I said, "Are you going to treat the assaults in any detail in your siege book?" And he said, no, I'm strictly gonna do the siege. And I said, well, how about I do the assaults and you do the siege, and then we'll have a pretty good look at that part of the Vicksburg campaign. He said, yeah, go ahead, that'd be good. So I did the assaults book. Unfortunately, he passed away before he did the siege book, and when that happened and he wasn't doing it anymore, I thought, well, the logical thing to do would be to carry the story right on forward from the assaults into the siege. And when I got done with that, I thought, well, heck, I've got a pretty good little series going here. I'll go back and do volumes 1, 2, and 3, and so that's how it worked out. I wish I'd done them in order, but I can't seem to think that far ahead.
Well, and that's quite all right. So then, after you had decided that, and I've read Ballard's work, and it's great. It's phenomenal. Um, uh, all of that said, how then did you decide on the chronological boundaries of each of your volumes? How did you decide on that?
Well, I kind of just let the story of the campaign lead me, and in some ways, it's very traditional. Breaking down the assaults from the siege. Um, there's a little bit in there that is, I don't know if I'd call it revolutionary, but a little bit contrary to the normal historiography. For instance, and this is something that Mike dwelled on and talked about a lot. We get the idea of 47 days of siege at Vicksburg, which there's a book, older book, Vicksburg, 47 days of siege. Well, it wasn't 47 days of siege. It was only about 43 or so, because you take the assaults out from May the 19th through the 22nd. There was no siege intended at all at that point. So that's not the beginning of the siege. In fact, Grant doesn't formally implement siege operations until the 25th. That's when his first order comes out. Although Sherman, some of the others are already digging in that vein. On the 23rd and even a little bit before, but you don't really get the siege started until the 25th. So that's a little bit of a difference there. The major difference in chronology probably would come. Most historians treat Grant's initial uh, attempts to reach Vicksburg or to get on the east side of the Mississippi River as including everything up to basically March the 29th, when Grant starts the movement on the west side of the river down through Richmond and the various plantations and all that. Um, I differ with that a little bit. I include the attempts going all the way to April the 29th. And really, for that matter, April 30th and somewhat even May the 1st. The Bio Battles books goes all the way to that point. And it's simply because at that point it was still an attempt. It had not succeeded as yet, and so the differentiation point for movement from the attempts to the inland campaign then is probably about a month later in the way I treat it, than what most historians would deal with. So just little minor things like that. So, but I let the chronology of the campaign basically guide me on how to break it down.
Well, I still think you did a phenomenal job of being able to balance kind of what you wanted to include in that, because the Vicksburg campaign, I think, is probably one of the most difficult campaigns to actually fully understand in the Civil War. And you might disagree with me on that, but at least my understanding of it, it was very hard for me to understand it really until I came across your work. But you also do a really phenomenal job of balancing the operational and strategic levels of war, as well as just like talking about individual human elements or experiences that they have within the campaign. How are you able to um, actually address each one of these while writing this whole series?
Well, again, I let the sources guide me. You obviously are going to use the general's reports and correspondence and high level stuff, all of that. Um, but you can't research a campaign like this without getting into the manuscript material of the common soldiers' letters and diaries and all of that. And so, just doing a really a huge amount of research is going to cast a wide net, and everything you get that is pertinent. It wasn't a instance of just I got to put this in because I got it. I learned a long time ago. Just because you got something don't mean you have to use it, or you have to include it. But if you cast a wide enough net, you're going to get all those different levels and all those different perspectives, and it'll make a much more well-rounded presentation and analysis and look at what was going on. And you have to look at it from all those areas, all those viewpoints.
You already talked a little bit about how Ballard influenced you, it seems a little bit, in producing this work. And so I'm actually curious how existing historiography, whether it's Bars, Ballard, or Miller, possibly shaped your interpretation of this whole campaign.
Well, I've heard historians talk about how they do things, and every historian has their own method and way of doing it. And none is necessarily right, none's necessarily wrong. It's just a matter of how you do things. The way I do it, and I've mentioned a couple times letting the sources lead me. I never read the secondary sources first. And I've heard some historians talk about this as how they do it. They get familiar with the story and all that. Um, but when I write something like this, I always write it from the perspective of the primary documents, the firsthand accounts, whether it's the officers' reports or the soldiers' letters or whatever. Um, and writing from the primary documents gives you the fresh, the new look at it. And then when I get it, basically written from the primary sources perspective, I always do go back, and I'd read Barr's, all three volumes years or decades ago. But I went back and at the end of each of the books, as I was finishing it up, I would read the pertinent sections of Bars, just for a couple different reasons. Number one, to make sure I didn't miss anything that was important. Number two, that I didn't miss any major sources that he may have used that are important. And number three, just to make sure that there's not a point of view out there that is contrary to what I came up with by using the primary sources. And so, I do read those and I utilize those, but I never do it first. I let the primary sources guide me for how I'm going, and then use that to kind of um, to finish up with. And some will say I regurgitate Bars, which I don't. I basically uh, deal with the primary sources, which is what he wrote, what he wrote his narrative from. And, of all things, we come up with kind of the same story from the same primary sources. That's odd how that happens. But so, yeah, that the historians have very much influenced me, and I learned a lot from Mike Ballard. I learned a lot from Ed. I did tours with Ed and knew him well. And others like Terry Winchell and Parker Hills and others have had big influences on me. But you always go to the primary sources initially.
Yeah, I always enjoyed going to the archives and getting into the primary sources. I was always shocked by what I found, and I'm sure you've probably had the same experience. Um,
Like a treasure
which
hunt. Well,
it is like a treasure hunt. It's like finding something that you've never seen before, and that you haven't found in other sources. I think it's really fun. Others might see that as extremely boring and whatever that might be, but
well, we
leave
are
it to
historians.
historians to really get into that. But my question to you though is, what was the most rewarding archival discovery you made while researching this series? Was there anything that really stuck out to you, or that it just it really impacted the way that you thought about something?
Oh, yeah, I would have to put some thought into that. Um, I the one that pops out in my mind is not actually Vicksburg related. I'll tell you the short story, but it kind of is pertinent to what you're asking there. When I was doing the Shallow book, dealing with Chalmers, Mississippi Brigade. In the official records, the only report we have from that brigade is Chalmers himself. There are no regimental reports. So I was sitting in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History one day looking at the Robert A. Smith papers, who was colonel of the 10th Mississippi, who was later killed at Munfordville in Kentucky, all of that. And I found a letter dated like April 10th, 1862. And I started reading it, and it started saying things like, I hereby submit my report of the Battle of Shiloh for the 10th Mississippi, and it was an unpublished handwritten report, from 4 days after the battle, which just blew my mind. It was absolutely, absolutely great. For the Vicksburg campaign, I think one of the things that just really fascinated me was looking at some of the logbooks for the naval vessels. The naval portion of the Vicksburg campaign is just absolutely critical. And looking at some of those logbooks in the National Archives, and they're so detailed and just so cool, and you can just imagine them, writing this every 4 hours, on the watches and all that. And they talk about how much steam is in the boilers and how much psi, and this, and then the officer of the deck or the day or whatever will sign it, at the bottom of that watch, and all that. That's some really, really cool stuff. I did have a little bit of an epiphany. I found all of the log books. A lot of them are published in the naval official records. You can get a lot of it there, but there's some that aren't. And so I looked at the USS Pittsburgh and Mound City and all those log books, for pertinent times in the Vicksburg campaign. And I thought, well, I'll look at the USS St. Louis, which then was the Baron de Kalb, and there was nothing there. And I thought, well, just for kicks, since the Cairo is down at Vicksburg, you can tour it. I'll look for the Cairo's. Nothing there either. And it dawned on me, I don't know why it didn't dawn on me beforehand, especially with the Cairo, that the log books for the Cairo and the Baron de Kalb are in the bottom of the Yazoo River, where both vessels sank, and probably in a safe that, who knows, it probably fell out of the Cairo as they were raising it or something, with all the mess that happened there. I'm pretty positive the log books for the Baron de Kalb are still on the Baron de Kalb at Yazoo City, which is still there. So that's some kind of interesting things that I really enjoy.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned before was when you originally got into this series was you were familiar with the campaign and you actually had visited a lot of these places. Well, there are some of our listeners have actually, this is maybe their first time really learning or even hearing about the Vicksburg campaign. And just for their own clarification, how would you briefly describe the terrain in this particular region that Grant is operating in, or that Pemberton is actually trying to defend?
Well, it's a hodgepodge of everything in the world you can think of. Vicksburg itself sits on these 200-300 foot bluffs overlooking the river. Just north of Vicksburg is the vast Mississippi Delta, which is a little bit misnamed. It's a proper name, really, rather than a geographical feature. A delta is where a river goes into an ocean or an estuary or gulf or something. This is more fittingly known, basically geology and all that, as an alluvial plain, but it's flat as a pancake, full water, all of that. Same thing opposite Vicksburg in Louisiana. And so if you're going to get to Vicksburg from the north or west, you're gonna have to go through these vast swamps, basically, and then navigate in the middle of all that the vast Mississippi River, which is huge in and of itself and makes that hairpin turn right at Vicksburg, which complicates things. And so if you're going to approach Vicksburg, you can only do it in limited ways. And so the way I actually describe Vicksburg, due to the terrain and all of that, Grant spent the first 7 months or so just trying to get to Vicksburg so that then he can start operations taking Vicksburg. So it takes him 7 months or so just to get there in a position where he can then start the last roughly 6 weeks or so that are the assaults and the siege of actually taking the place. So just getting there is problematic enough. In fact, he writes a letter to Julia, really telling letter that says something to the effect of in all other campaigns all I've had to do is just fight the enemy. This one I gotta really struggle just to even get to the point where I can fight him, and so that's really telling in terms of geography and terrain.
Okay. Well, I actually have a series of questions here for you now for each one of the volumes. It's just going to be a couple. Um, but I actually want to just go in chronological order. So we're actually just going to start off with your early struggles for Vicksburg. But one of the first questions I actually have, and this is just more of a personal question for me, because one of the first things you actually start talking about in the book is both these two guys, Karl von Clausewitz and Henry Antoine Jomini, both of which are military theorists. They really have nothing to do with the Vicksburg campaign or anything like that. They're from Europe. But could you tell us a little bit more about them and how Clausewitz's ideas became a very central theme in this book as well as some of your others?
Right. These two do make a lot of appearances in the book, um, in the books, the whole series, because in the Vicksburg campaign we see a major transition that primarily Grant makes from a Jominian to a Clausewitzian. And this really opened my. I've always been fascinated with Jomini and Clausewitz and their comparison. Some historians say, well, they're basically alike. Some historians say, no, they're very, very different. And actually, I'm chasing a rabbit here, but my next two books that are already completed and gone to the publisher, all that kind of stuff. One is a comparison of Napoleonic and Civil War battles, kind of an apples to apples comparison. And when I was doing the research, I'm very grateful to the University of Tennessee Martin. They actually sent me over to Europe or paid for a research trip. I convinced them that if I was going to write about these Napoleonic battles, I needed to see the battlefield. So I made a grand tour of Wagram and Austerlitz and Jena and Ulm and all of those battlefields. And so there are major comparisons. There are Napoleonic battles that are just very extremely similar to Civil War battles. And they picked up on it in the Civil War themselves. For instance, Halleck, when Halleck gets Grant's report after Vicksburg, he writes Grant. It's just fascinating, and says your operations against Vicksburg are very similar. Compare most favorably, he says, to Napoleon's operations about Ulm. And so I thought, wow, that's interesting. I don't know anything about Ulm, so I started looking at it, and I thought, well, I've got an article here. I'm gonna write an article comparing Vicksburg and Ulm. And then I had so much fun doing that. I took it to. I had bought all the Ulm material. There are no major books really. One little one on the Ulm campaign. Most of it's contained in the Austerlitz literature. And so I read all of that Austerlitz and I thought, that's Chickamauga. That is absolutely Chickamauga. And so I wrote an article on that and I thought, this is a book. And so I finished that. The second one, dealing with Napoleonic history and all of that, is a comparison of Jomini and Clausewitz and their influence, and I say that lightly, on Civil War commanders. I think there's much more Jominian influence in the Civil War than there is Clausewitzian influence, obviously because Clausewitz wasn't translated into English until the 1870s. But rather than necessarily influence, what I do is compare, and I'm getting to the Vicksburg part of this. It's a long explanation, but I compare uh, Clausewitz and Jomini on the operational offensive level. There's a lot of theoretical stuff you can't compare them with. They're apples and oranges, but on the practical, offensive, operational level, there's a lot you can compare Jomini and Clausewitz with. And so, if there's not a lot of influence, particularly on Clausewitz's part on Civil War commanders, there is a lot of usage of Clausewitz's mentality and his theory of operational offensive warfare. And so, the next question then, obviously, is how did these Civil War commanders come up with Clausewitz's ideas if they've never read him? Well, a lot of it's common sense, and this is where we're getting to Grant. Grant figures out a lot of Clausewitzian mentality, having never read, to my knowledge, and he never mentions it. He didn't even read Jomini much, um, but he figures out, as do others, the Clausewitzian mentality. So the usage of each of those provides a wonderful way to compare Jominian commanders in the Civil War and Clausewitzian commanders in the Civil War, even though they had never probably even some of them heard of Clausewitz. And so I argued my standard argument for those that like country music from the 70s and 80s. If Barbara Mandrell was country when country wasn't cool, Grant and others were Clausewitzian before Clausewitz was cool. And they picked up on it through basically common sense. So the Vicksburg campaign, all that to say this, the Vicksburg campaign, we see Grant start out as a strict Jominian. Lines of supply, decisive points, all of that kind of stuff. And he's basically doing what his boss Halleck, who's still looking over his shoulder. Halleck is one of the great Jominians of the Civil War. How Halleck would want it done. So Grant starts it that way in the early struggles book, Mississippi Central Campaign, all that. Ultimately, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself into the other volumes, but he figures out, okay, this don't work in this particular environment. I've got to come up with something new. So he starts thinking outside the box, which leads him more toward Clausewitzian territory of breaking from the supply lines that we see later on in the volumes, all that kind of stuff. So that's where they make their appearance, and we see a clear movement of Grant from Jominian mindset to Clausewitzian mindset in the Vicksburg campaign.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. As you know, I'm working on a manuscript stipulating that Grant possessed the Kudoy, and
Yeah.
you know
Okay, I didn't know
I found.
you were working on Napoleonic stuff.
Not necessarily Napoleonic, but I mean, it's focused on what Jomini and Clausewitz both define as a military genius, which is the
Okay, all
possession
right.
of that trait.
The instant
Um,
you and seeing it in an
yeah,
instant. Yeah.
yeah, and something that I found interesting actually was, and we can talk about this later, but at Champions Hill, Grant loved using reserves. That was one of his big things, and it's very Napoleonic esque, I suppose. But um, I used to study Napoleonic warfare a long time ago. It's initially what I tried to go study, but I realized I didn't speak French, so that was an issue.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm getting away from myself just a little bit here.
This is fascinating.
So, so really quickly, just to kind of wrap up the early struggles for Vicksburg's, what are some of the misconceptions about Grant's overland route to Vicksburg through the Mississippi Central that you want to address, whether it's the operations around Chickasaw Bayou or Grant being having to turn around because of his loss of supplies at Holly Springs?
Well, I think continuing the whole Jominian mindset of having a secured line of supply. And Grant talks about this in his memoirs. Of course, he can say pretty much anything he wants to decades later after he's president of the United States for 2 terms and all that. But he talks about he learned on the way back that there's enough food out there that you can survive an army, at least for a little bit. Without a true line of supply. So he starts thinking outside the box there. I think another maybe is Chickasaw Bayou. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention. It's not one of the major battles that people talk about, but it's a very important little battle. and really a cool little battlefield. The American Battlefield Trust is doing some really good work down there in preserving the battlefield. The vast majority of it's very well preserved, and it's just a great little battlefield down there.
Well, moving on to the Bayou battles for Vicksburg, I'm going to kind of combine some of the questions here, but I think this is the part of the campaign where it gets very confusing. So Grant is turned back, and now he has to look for a different way to try to even, as you talked about, attack Pemberton or get on solid ground. And this leads to a series of different attempts to get at Vicksburg. Okay, so then why did he even bother making all of these different attempts in the Mississippi Bayou? Did his failures impact his standing in Washington, D.C., whether it's with Lincoln or others?
Definitely, a lot of it is political. Some of it, the thing you mainly hear in the historiography is that he wanted to keep his guys busy, and muscles tend to get a little lax and all that if you just sit the winter out type thing. But really, he is, and in one of his, I think it was in his around the world trip when he's talking to the newspaper correspondent Young, he talks about we were all on a pretty short leash at that point, and if we don't produce results, then they'll take our heads, kind of thing. So he is very much thinking politically, and this is part of what goes into the Clausewitzian viewpoint, which war is an extension of politics. You got to keep the political aspects of this in the forefront. And you're talking about the coup d'etat. Grant is just at a glance sees that as well. He's very very perceptive in what's going on, and he's getting letters from Halleck and everybody else talking about Lincoln is getting pretty impatient here. We've got to do something. What's going on? How can you do a little more? And then they get it. Later in the spring they get this great letter from Secretary Stanton that goes out to Grant in Mississippi, Rosecrans in Middle Tennessee, and Hooker in Virginia. It says the first one of you that wins a major victory gets the major generalship that's available. And Grant and Hooker, to my knowledge, Hooker, just pockets it and says, "Okay, I'll try that." Rosecrans just, has a coronary almost. I will not be bribed. You can't auction off honor and all that kind of stuff. But we see Grant. He has to be trying something, and the idea of each of these attempts, they are, the way I describe them, they are very low risk but very high reward if they worked. None of them's going to put the Army at great risk. There are only smaller units, division level, brigade level, whatever, involved in any of these. Now, Steele's Bayou almost cost Grant the Navy, but none of them are really that high risk. And he's basically biding his time. Everything's covered with water in these delta areas, and he's got to try something to utilize the water as a benefit rather than a hindrance. And these waterborne operations is just about all he can do till things start drying out over in late March and April, and certainly May when he starts the last attempt, which is high risk. I mean, there's no going back from this one. There's no later plan. If this one doesn't work, this is all or nothing. So Grant is reading the room. He realizes there's some political pressures going on here, and he's trying his best. He later talks about, I really didn't think any of these were going to work, in his memoirs and all that. But if you read the correspondence at the time, he has great hope that each of these will work and will produce that victory and probably get him the major generalship that's available at the same time.
Well, and it seems that with each one of these attempts, it seems like he's getting closer and closer with each one, or he's starting to kind of figure out, okay, I need to do this or need to do that. Now, of course, they fail regardless. Um, but the fact of the matter is that he's starting to realize that I have to make sure I keep my connections in Washington relatively decent, and it seems that these attempts are enough to at least um, keep the authorities in Washington very happy, or at least pleased with the fact that he's trying something.
It buys him some
Um,
time. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but needless to say, your book on the bio battles for Vicksburg is excellent,
I
and
appreciate that.
he eventually does land south of Vicksburg. He finally gets there, and so then once he lands in May, there's a 17-day period there that's very, very crucial to the campaign's trajectory. Could you briefly explain why that is so significant in that 17 days?
Because this is whatever it is, Plan G or H or whatever, the seventh attempt, and again, there is no Plan I or whatever comes next. If this one fails, Grant probably goes down with it, and Sherman and the rest of them as well, perhaps the Army, because when you cross the Mississippi River into the wilds of Mississippi, as I call it, there's no way to get out of there quickly if you are defeated. So it becomes critical. The other part of this is Grant is knowingly and willingly sacrificing his supply line, secure supply line, which is Jomini is spinning in his grave when he if he knew about this. Grant's putting himself in a position on the opposite side of his base of supplies, which is basically Memphis or even down at Vicksburg, Milliken's Bend, Young's Point, with the enemy in between and a huge river once he crosses the river in between. And so this is absolutely not by the book. And it's more Clausewitzian in nature. Clausewitz talks about, when it comes down to feeding the army or winning the victory, they can go without food a little while. And so Grant has this window that he really has to walk a fine line of how fast he moves away from what little supply he's getting from Grand Gulf area once he takes Grand Gulf, until he can reach the Yazoo River north of Vicksburg when supplies will start flowing easily. So there's a window in there when he has no real line of supply. Now he muddies this. He talks about breaking loose from his line of supply in his memoirs, I think on like the fourth or fifth or sixth, and then he says, "Well, I broke loose from my line of supply on the 10th or 12th or whatever." You can't break loose twice. He muddies the waters a little bit on this, but he doesn't have a realistic major line of supply like Jomini would have wanted, or Halleck, or Rosecrans, or McClellan, or any of these great Jominians. And so it's a fine line of how fast you move, how many battles you fight. If you move too fast, you might stumble into a mess, get defeated or something like that, and have to fall back, and then you're in a real mess. If you move too slowly, your army's going to run out of food, and they dang near do. By the time you start reading, and this is what's so important about those soldier letters and diaries and all that. It is absolutely mind blowing how little food there is in the Army of the Tennessee on the May 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 time frame. That really second or third week of May. And that's why I argue if Pemberton had delayed a little more, Joseph E. Johnston, you start running out of food too long, and that starts affecting your ability to march and fight and all of that. But it works out. Grant threads the needle and reaches the Yazoo by the 18th, and supplies start flowing in within just a matter of days, and it's a done deal at that point.
Well, in this time frame, you mentioned that he's going to fight a series of battles. He's going to fight a series of 5 battles. He'll be present, I think, at 4 of them. Um, but with these five battles, whether it's Port Gibson, and then there's a very interesting gap of time between Port Gibson and the Battle of Raymond, where he's trying to get supplies up and everything else. But he fights Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champions Hill, and then he fights on the Big Black River. Of those five battles, which do you actually think has the greatest strategic consequence and why, especially when it comes to this campaign?
Well, I think Champion Hill obviously is the most important of them. Champion Hill, Decisive Battle for Vicksburg. There's a book named that. But that's the one where Pemberton brings the bulk of his army out to confront Grant. And that's really the only one where, the others, even Port Gibson certainly, and Raymond and Jackson, Grant's hitting, peripheral parts of the Confederate Army. Pemberton brings the bulk, three of his five divisions, out and meets Grant at Champion Hill. So this is where it's decided, really. Pemberton finds himself, I think, out of position. I think he would have been a much better option to hold behind the Big Black River and delay Grant had he known what's going on logistically in the Army of the Tennessee. He would have been much better off doing that. Of course, Grant could have crossed it several different places, but if you hold at the railroad bridge and then several of the fords and ferries to the north at Birdsong and Bridgeport and others, several to the south, I mean, you could have spread your army out and if not stopped Grant, certainly Grant can go a little farther to the next ferry up from wherever your line of defense stops. But that's going to take time. And if Pemberton could not have stopped Grant necessarily from crossing the Big Black River at some point, he could certainly have delayed him. And that gets back into the logistical aspects of this. But Pemberton instead chooses to cross the Big Black River and gets out of position, not only across the Big Black River, but also across Baker's Creek. And it's significant that in retreating back across both of those, Baker's Creek and the Big Black River, Pemberton loses nearly two full divisions of his army. At Champion Hill, he loses Loring's division, and he loses a lot of Bowen's division in the debacle at Big Black River Bridge, trying to get back across that river. So he finds himself very much out of position, and Grant takes advantage of it. But the big blow is Champion Hill.
Well, now to actually get to the very first book that you actually wrote of the series, which is the Union assaults on Vicksburg. Um, I think this particular part of the campaign, Grant wins all these battles, but now comes a very controversial part of the campaign, which is these assaults that take place on Vicksburg, and some historians have said they shouldn't have happened, and that even in Grant's memoirs, Grant said that he regrets that second assault on Vicksburg. He actually mentioned that alongside the Battle of Cold Harbor. Um, so, what are some misunderstandings about those assaults do you actually most often encounter?
Well, I think dealing with Grant, talking about the regret there, and I've heard some even Army officers talking about Grant shouldn't have attacked because it was just needless bloodshed and all that, and I would never even begin to think about um, arguing with a military officer that's been in combat. I wouldn't begin to question that. I respect that too much. However, if you look at Grant's situation, he has just defeated Pemberton, the bulk of Pemberton's army, in the last 2 days at Champion Hill and Big Black River Bridge. He's approaching Vicksburg. He thinks he thinks the Confederates are the morale is low and that we'll just walk right into Vicksburg. And again, getting back to the whole Clausewitz thing, Clausewitz's idea is just keep pounding, 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 never let up. If you ever let up, then the whole thing stalls. You got to keep moving, keep the pressure on. And I think that's what Grant is thinking, and I tend to agree with Grant that the proper thing was to just go right up, don't give them a chance to catch their breath and assault. And who knows, we may end this thing, right here on the 19th. Of course, it fails on the 19th, and then he tries again on the 22nd. But talking about Grant's memoirs and the regret, I think Grant is talking about the renewal of the May 22nd assaults. I don't think he necessarily regrets the morning assault on May the 22nd. To me, that is very much within the realm of possibility to do this thing right and end this campaign today. But the whole thing about McClernand, calling for reinforcements and calling for renewal on other parts of the lines, and Grant just doesn't want anything to do with it, and Sherman talks him into it. I think that's the part he's talking about, regretting that we started the second assaults on May the 22nd, although he doesn't make it totally clear.
I was fortunate enough to visit Vicksburg with a former major in the military, and uh, he had some very interesting views about the assaults and the siege of Vicksburg. He actually did staff rides at Gettysburg and at Perryville. And the one thing he couldn't believe was actually how close some of McClernand's men actually got to the Confederate line. He actually wanted to go walk that whole line to see what that was actually like. He couldn't believe it. But needless to say, I think one of the most interesting cases that you make in that whole book is actually towards the end, when you talk about how, had the Union assault actually worked, there might not have been a Gettysburg. And so I wanted you to just briefly comment on that, but also there was a question I actually had earlier that I wanted to ask you, and I know we're kind of touching a sensitive point, I think. Um, but do you see Vicksburg as equally as decisive as that of Gettysburg within the Civil War? Maybe more so.
Yeah, well, you get into the whole East versus West thing, and I'm very biased toward the West. Um, to me, the East is primarily a stalemate the whole 4 years. And of course, I mean, it wraps up basically at Appomattox, and at that point, um, after Appomattox, the thing is practically done. The war doesn't end there, but it's practically, for all purposes, done. Um, but as the stalemate occurs, and Gettysburg is one of those stalemates. What really changed as a result of Gettysburg, besides the loss of all those casualties? I mean, they basically go back to where they started from, and there's some even that argue that it was a great raid, and the Confederates came out better logistically than they were after, before the raid. They brought a lot of stuff back from Pennsylvania. Um, Contrast that with out west, where the amount of territory is taken, the Mississippi River is open, the amount of slaves that are freed, the logistical railroads, roads, bridges, infrastructure, factories, all of that is are damaged and destroyed and put out of operation. The the touch points of Union, uh, maybe not occupation, but Union presence um, to all of those Confederate civilians that are impacted by this, touched by it. Relatively few in Virginia that back and forth and back and forth, and they got it all the time. But just the amount of Confederate civilians that are influenced by this, morale wise, another Clausewitzian thing, hitting the morale wheel of the people. To me, I equate it as if the Northern armies are trying to bail water out of the Confederate bathtub. And the Army of the Potomac for 4 years is dipping water out of the top with a cup, while the Army of the Tennessee and other Western armies are tearing the bottom out of the tub and draining the tub. That so in terms of, I got a text there. I'm sorry about that. But in terms of the the amount of impact that comes in the West, and hence Vicksburg is a huge part of that. Is a no brainer. The Vicksburg is just so much more important. You can't take it one campaign and say that was where it won lost. It's all in a vacuum. It all works together, but to me, out west, in particular Vicksburg, is where so much more impact occurs. And there are a lot of historians that every time I'm reading Bruce Catton or James McPherson or somewhere, and they talk about this, I mark it just as fuel for fodder for the grist mill or whatever. And McPherson talks about war basically won in the West. Catton talks about it. Mr. Gettysburg, Gary Edelman himself of the Battlefield Trust, talks about how much more important Vicksburg is than Gettysburg in a military sense.
Yes, and by the way, I very much agree with you. But it's always I think it's always a great conversation to have, and it's just
Sure.
one of those
Yeah.
fun,
I
ongoing
don't
piece.
disparage the Eastern
Yeah,
folks.
yeah, it's just a
A
fun
lot of
piece of
fighting over
conversation to
stuff.
continue. Um, so I suppose moving from the assaults to the siege itself. So the two assaults, they don't work. That's okay. Grant's going to settle for a siege. Could you just walk us through or explain the challenges that the Union and Confederate soldiers actually had during the time of the siege? Because it's going to last for roughly, oh man, a month and a half or so.
Right. Right. Well, the challenges are by far harder for the Confederates than they are the Union. Uh, One, because there are a lot more Union soldiers than there are Confederates. Two, the Confederates being the defenders, they got to be on alert at all times, at all places, because you don't know when the next assault is going to come or where it's going to be. And so you got to basically stay on alert and be prepared at all times. Whereas Union, generals can alternate their troops in and out and have some time off and all that. Um, then you've got the real domination on the Union side of sharpshooting and cannon fire and all of that, and they're just pummeling the Confederate works, and the Confederates just hunker down a little bit more. So it's constant misery, particularly on the Confederate side. It's not just great for the Federals either. They're involved with snakes that they've never seen, and chiggers and spiders and everything in the world down here in Mississippi that they don't know anything about. But war is not good for anybody, obviously, but it's much harsher for the Confederates on the inside. And I tried to display that a lot as much as I could. And I would take sections. I tried to do the siege as much chronologically as possible, using some of the big events like blowing up the mine or the sinking of the Cincinnati or something to deal with those chronological issues. But I would intersperse within those chapters, and this was the most challenging of the books to write. Because a lot of it was fairly generic, talking about sharpshooting or life in the lines or civilians in Vicksburg. So I would move around sections in chapters back and forth to try to get the chapters all even, basically, and all that. But looking at the human aspect of this was really fascinating. This is where those diaries and letters and obviously all of that comes in too. But it was fun to do. It was a challenge, but hopefully the human aspect comes out in the siege book.
Well, just again, when I was actually at Vicksburg, I visited in mid July
Yeah.
with this former major, and we would actually have to get up at 4:30 in the morning to. We went to all these different places, whether it was Raymond or Champions Hill, and we wore jeans so that way we could actually walk through the tall grass regardless of how hot it was.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time it got to be 1 or 2 in the afternoon, it was actually unbearable
Yeah, brutal.
to just be outside. So that's when we would actually kind of give up our time outside, and that's when we would try to find some cooling elsewhere. But
And then it'll
yeah, I
start
can't.
raining, and you think, rain, yay, but it's hotter and muggier and more humid after the rain than it is before. So that's just Mississippi in the summer.
That so I can't simply imagine what those guys went through, whether it be Confederate or Union. But getting back to the siege itself, I think one of the questions that comes up from time to time is I think there's a question about was it really the circumvallation of Vicksburg itself that led to the surrender of Vicksburg, or were there other elements involved that clearly impacted um, Pemberton and the high command deciding that, yeah, we need to surrender?
Well, some have argued that Grant starved Vicksburg, and that's not necessarily the case. When Pemberton surrendered, he had about 5 days worth of food left. Now, what he considered as usable food was basically gone. That 5 days was reserved for a breakout attempt. That if the Confederate Army tried to break out, they would carry 5 days rations with them for use in the field in their escape. After 6 weeks of this, though, the muscles of the Confederate soldiers that have been sitting in these trenches for weeks and weeks at a time, everybody concluded basically that there is no breakout attempt. And so you get to the end of the ready rations that you can use, and you still got 5 days extra. And there's not going to be a breakout attempt. So what do? Do you just go ahead and surrender, even though you've got 5 more days rations? Because at that point, they pretty sure Joseph E. Johnson's not coming at that point. Or do you use up all of those rations? Some argue that we go ahead and start the process of negotiation while we still have rations, so that we can negotiate from a position of strength rather than emergency. Same thing with ammunition. Pemberton still has a lot of ammunition left, and so I don't think it was a matter of supply necessarily. It was a matter of engineering. There's a great book written on the engineering aspects of Vicksburg. Um, Essentially, the federal approaches had reached the Confederate fortifications by the end of June, early July. At the same time, the Federal artillery had pummeled the Confederate fortifications till they're just almost non-existent anymore. And to rebuild each night, the Confederates have to dig deeper, so they're almost subterranean at this point. On top of that, the Federals have started to dig mines under, it's like 10 mines under several of the major forts, and they're getting ready to blow those. In fact, Grant orders an assault, blow all the mines, and assault on July the 6th. By that point, Pemberton realizes that we're dug out of Vicksburg. They're within just a matter of feet outside our fortifications, which back in May they had to cross hundreds of yards of territory that to get to our fortifications. Now they're right here. It's just seconds, and they'll be within our fortifications. So Pemberton realized, with all of that put together, there is no way that we can withstand an assault. That's obviously coming. They're already blowing up some of the mines, all of that kind of stuff. And so Pemberton realizes the game is up. If Johnston's not coming to relieve us, then the game is up, and he'll start the process of surrendering there. So I think the engineering aspects are much more important than the logistical aspects.
So as we actually start to wrap up here, there's one final question I have for you, which is, what is one key insight you hope your readers actually take away from your work, whether it be the Vicksburg campaign series, or any of your other books for that matter?
Well, in dealing with all of them, really, the like you talk about the human aspect of this, just how terrible war is, how harsh war is, and just what an effect it has on people personally. Obviously, death and all that, and suffering. And you can only get that through those letters and diaries and the personal accounts. Vicksburg specifically, I think, in terms of particularly military and leadership. If you want to get into Clausewitz and Jomini and Coudet and all of that, But I think the big lesson here is the change that comes over Ulysses S. Grant and how he does things, and the sheer amount of adaptability that he utilizes. Things go wrong. Okay, not the end of the world. We'll do something different. And he never panics. He never gives up, and he just fights it out to the end, and is very successful, and thereby becomes our greatest general from the Civil War, because he uses these aspects in other places as well. Overland campaign, adaptability, all of that, and so we really see the growth and maturity of Ulysses S. Grant in the Vicksburg campaign, and I think that is definitely some traits that modern military officers and leaders in business and government or whatever can utilize and learn. There we go again with these texts. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, I think it's the Grant's adaptability and leadership that is the key feature here.
Okay. Well, again, we are here with Dr. Timothy B. Smith, author of the Vicksburg Campaign series. Thank you again for coming on today. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed discussing Vicksburg with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for all of our listeners out there, please make sure to subscribe to The Dramatic Historian and sign up for History Fix, where you can find everything there is to history. Happy Friday, everyone.